The silent attic. The house was older than any map could properly tell. Its stone walls sagged, its windows leaned, and its roof was a patchwork of tiles mottled by centuries of storms. It sat on the far end of the village, near where the road dissolved into fields of wheat and chestnut trees. When I was told to stay there for a time, I thought little of it. Old houses in Italy are like that, weathered, crooked, patched with care but never truly mended. But I did not yet know about the attic. The attic stretched across the length of the house, just beneath the roof, a wide and unfinished chamber that carried the weight of forgotten generations. When I first climbed the narrow staircase, the air grew instantly different, thick, warm, stagnant, as though it had not moved in years. Dust coated every surface, soft and gray, muting the edges of trunks, chairs, and collapsed furniture that had been abandoned there. Sunlight pierced through a single cracked window at the far end, its beam heavy with drifting particles that never seemed to settle. The smell was what struck me most, a mixture of dry wood, mildew, and something faintly sweet, like fruit that had rotted long ago and never left. It clung to my clothes, my hair, until I felt as though I carried the attic with me even after I descended. The house creaked constantly, its bones shifting with the wind, but the attic had a sound of its own. Not movement, not the familiar groan of beams, but a resonance. A hollow quiet, stretched so tightly it became almost a pressure. The silence up there was unlike anywhere else. It swallowed sound, softened footsteps, and left me with the impression that if I spoke, the air itself would resist. The first night, I lay awake beneath that attic, hearing it above me. The house had many noises, but the attic had none. No shifting, no settling, no rustle of vermin. Only silence, deep and absolute, a silence that pressed through the ceiling as though the space itself leaned downward to smother me. By the third day, I began to sense it more keenly. Whenever I stood at the foot of the staircase, the air seemed colder, though no draft touched my skin. My gaze was drawn upward, to the black square where the attic door waited. I would linger staring, certain that if I climbed, something would be different than before. I tried to dismiss it as imagination, but the weight of that silence grew heavier each time I passed. Eventually, I forced myself up again. Dust curled beneath my steps, disturbed into brief clouds. The air was even thicker than I remembered, and though I told myself it was heat, my skin prickled as though I had stepped into something living. I stood in the center of the room, listening. Nothing. Not a bird above the roof, not a whisper of wind. Only silence so complete that my own breathing seemed profane, intrusive. I began to notice details I had overlooked. Small depressions in the dust, faint indentations as though something had once sat there and been lifted away. Too small for furniture, too round for boxes. They resembled the impressions left by knees or hands pressing into soft earth. There were many of them, scattered across the floor, clustered near the far wall where the light never reached. That night, the silence changed. As I lay in bed, the absence of sound above me sharpened into something else. It was not that nothing moved. It was that something was deliberately still, as though whatever lingered in the attic held itself motionless, waiting. I could feel it through the ceiling, a weight that deepened with every hour. On the fifth night, I woke without knowing why. The room was dark, the shutters closed, but I sensed it instantly. The attic was no longer silent. I heard it faintly, almost beneath hearing, the sound of breath. Not the steady rhythm of sleep, but shallow, uneven, as though a child tried to stifle sobs. The noise drifted downward, through the boards, sinking into my room like water. I pressed myself against the mattress, every nerve awake, listening until dawn. When I climbed the stairs the next day, the silence had returned. Yet the dust was disturbed. The depressions were deeper now, clearer. Small knees, small palms, pressed hard into the floorboards. And trailing away from them were lines, as though fingers had been dragged slowly across the dust, reaching outward. The house grew heavier as days passed. The air downstairs carried the attic's scent, sharp and stale. Shadows stretched unnaturally, gathering near the stairwell. I avoided going up, but my thoughts circled it constantly. I began to dream of it, the cracked window, the shifting dust, the rows of invisible children kneeling in silence, their heads bowed. I would wake with my throat dry, my ears straining for the breath I prayed not to hear. On my last night, the silence finally broke. I was sitting upright in bed, unable to close my eyes when it began. A faint patter above me, irregular, like hands drumming lightly against wood. Then a scrape, deliberate, slow, as though something heavy was being dragged across the floor. The air grew suffocating, thick with dust that seemed to fall though the ceiling was sealed. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of many small feet moving in unison. Not hurried, not playful, methodical. A slow, synchronized shifting, like rows of bodies rising to their feet. The boards groaned faintly, the first sound I had ever heard the attic make, and it carried through me with a weight that made my teeth ache. I dared not move. I could feel them above, directly overhead now, their presence heavy as stone. The silence returned, but it was not empty. It was filled with their listening, their waiting. My chest burned with each shallow breath, terrified that the sound would betray me. Hours seemed to pass in that unbearable stillness. When dawn finally seeped through the shutters, the attic exhaled, its pressure easing. The silence thinned, became once again the absence of sound rather than the fullness of it. But I knew what had been above me. I left that morning. I did not pack, I did not linger. The house still stands, the attic still sealed by its silence. But sometimes, when the night is too still, I feel it pressing on me again. The weight of many small bodies kneeling, waiting, their silence louder than any scream. The attic was never empty. It was listening, and it always will be. Whispers from the cellar. The house carried its age in the way the air moved within it. Every breath of wind that slid past the shutters seemed to shiver through stone, dragging with it scents that no open window could clear away. Dust, mold, and something deeper, something that seemed to cling to the foundation itself, rising from beneath the floorboards with the damp persistence of memory. The cellar was the heart of it. I first noticed its presence not because of what it was, but because of what it wasn't. The rest of the house groaned and shifted in familiar ways, would contracting at night, old beams murmuring under the weight of time. But the cellar had a different language. It pulsed with stillness, an anchored quiet that resisted intrusion. Whenever I passed the narrow wooden door that led down, the hairs along my arms lifted as though brushing against invisible cobwebs. The air changed near that threshold. It grew heavier, metallic, laced with a faint sweetness that turned the stomach. Even standing before it, I could feel the temperature shift, a breath of coolness sliding outward, as though the darkness within exhaled against the house. I avoided it at first. A space that old, tucked beneath stone foundations, would be expected to smell of damp earth and rotting wood. Yet what pressed against me from beneath was something else, something more alive, though long since past life. One evening, when the house felt too restless to ignore, I forced myself to descend. The stairs creaked under my weight, shallow steps slick with moisture. The deeper I went, the more the air thickened, tasting of rust and soil. My candle flame guttered, though no draft touched me. The cellar opened wider than I expected. Its walls were rough-hewn stone, sweating with condensation. Wooden shelves lined the space, their contents long decayed. Jars clouded with blackened matter, bottles collapsed inward with age, lids eaten through by rust. A scattering of broken crates leaned in corners, their planks warped and furred with mold. The floor was dirt, uneven, packed hard in some places and soft in others, as though disturbed and tamped down repeatedly. And there was the sound. At first, I mistook it for the candle, its faint hiss as wax dripped. But when I stilled, I heard it more clearly. A murmur low and hushed, threading through the air as though woven into the stones themselves. It was not in any tongue I could name. It carried no cadence of speech, no rise or fall, only a continuous string of syllables too faint to grasp. My chest tightened as I listened, for I realized it came not from one place, but from all directions at once. The longer I stood there, the clearer it became. A chorus, not a single voice. Countless threads whispering at once, overlapping, impossible to separate. I strained my ears, but the words dissolved the harder I tried, leaving me dizzy, as though comprehension hovered just beyond reach. I left quickly that night, nearly stumbling up the stairs, the door closing behind me with a weight that echoed through the house. But the whispers did not stay below. That night, as I lay awake, I could hear them faintly through the floor. Not constant, but rising and falling like a tide, brushing against the edges of sleep, coaxing me to listen. Each time I descended after that, the cellar revealed itself differently. The shadows lengthened, stretching far beyond where the candle could reach. The smell grew sharper, clinging like iron to my skin. I began to notice shapes in the dirt floor, shallow depressions circular, like bowls pressed into the earth. They were too regular, too deliberate, and when I knelt to touch them, I found the soil colder inside than anywhere else. One evening, my candle burned lower than expected, its wax spilling fast, as though devoured by the cellar's air. In its dim light, I thought I saw movement. Not large, not sudden, but the subtle shifting of the dirt itself. As if the ground were unsettled beneath me, rising and falling in slow, almost imperceptible breaths. That night, the whispers grew stronger. They seeped through the floorboards, curling into my room. Their texture changed, less like a chorus, more like individual strands pressing close, brushing the edge of my hearing. I felt them against my skin, subtle vibrations, as though the whispers carried weight. My own breath sounded wrong in the darkness, too loud, a violation of their hushed communion. By the end of the week, I could no longer pretend it was imagination. The cellar wanted me to listen. The final time I descended, the air was different. Thicker, colder. My candle sputtered the moment I crossed the threshold, the flame bending low as if bowing to the dark. The whispers rose immediately, swelling like a hidden congregation waiting only for my arrival. They pressed into me, wrapped around me, 1,000 soft threads brushing my ears, my throat, my ribs. The floor was no longer still. In the far corner, the soil rippled, not violently, but with the slow persistence of something rising. My eyes locked onto the movement, unable to look away. The whispers surged, crowding, as though urging me closer. My body leaned before I realized it, my steps pulling me toward the corner where the dirt shifted like water under breath. I froze inches away. The soil quivered, then cracked open with a sound softer than silk tearing. What lay beneath was not bone nor wood, but a darkness darker than the room itself. A hollow so absolute it swallowed the candle's glow, drank it into its depth. The whispers poured upward from it, stronger, clearer, yet still incomprehensible, a desperate tide of sound clawing to be heard. I staggered back, nearly dropping the candle. My breath came ragged, loud, and at once the whispers recoiled. Not away, but inward, collapsing into the hollow like water retreating down a drain. The soil shuddered once, then sealed itself, leaving no trace of the rupture, only smooth, damp earth. The silence that followed was unbearable. Not true silence, but an emptiness left behind, raw and expectant, as though a word had been cut off before its last syllable. I fled then up the stairs, through the door, slamming it shut. I thought it would end there, but it hasn't. Even now, far from that house, I sometimes hear it when the night grows too long. A faint thread of sound, curling beneath the hum of the world. Whispers that press against my ears, against the bone of my skull, patient, waiting. They are not gone. They were never bound to that cellar alone. They followed me, and they will never stop whispering.